So you're all aware of the COVID-19 pandemic that we have been struggling with for the past year, but what you might not be aware of is a much larger, much more insidious health pandemic that is happening just behind the COVID epidemic, and that is the mental health crisis. So we've been dealing with the mental health crisis in this country for some time, but many people aren't aware of it. Because mental health is typically seen as different than physical health, and that you can't see a mental disorder the same way you can see a broken arm or leg. So I kind of want to talk about where we are right now in this crisis and what tools we've got to handle the crisis, as well as what tools we've got that we aren't necessarily utilizing, that we potentially should be utilizing. So where are we? According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 20% of Americans are struggling with some form of mental illness. That's 51 million Americans, or 1 in 5 who's struggling with a mental illness, and 1 in 25 who's struggling with serious mental illness, which is something that requires clinical treatment and is debilitating and alters your day-to-day life. So given that this many people are struggling, what are they struggling with? Well, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the two most prevalent disorders in this country are anxiety and depressive disorders. Now, these disorders are dangerous because not only can they become worse as time goes on, they can also be comorbid, i.e. someone who's struggling with depression is also struggling with anxiety, and potentially vice versa. So we know that people are struggling, and we know somewhat with what, but what are we doing about this? Are they being treated? Well, the answer is not enough. 60% of youth with depression don't receive treatment. That's 1 in 3. And only 27% of individuals with chronic depression or youth with chronic depression are being treated. And that's not necessarily to say that their treatment was successful. It simply means that they are receiving consistent care. So one more fact about this crisis that I hope really helps paint where we are with it is from Mental Health America, and that is that the average onset of symptoms to the actual treatment of those symptoms is about 11 years. So that means your average individual, and this ranges all of the different mental illnesses that people struggle with, goes over a decade without receiving any treatment. And in many cases that means that they have gone undiagnosed, and people aren't aware that they have a mental illness. So they're not aware how that it could be treated, or that what is affecting their life could be treated. So what are we doing about this crisis? What tools do we have to help people, and are people being helped? As we've seen, not enough, and I'd like to focus mainly on anxiety and depression, as these are the two most prevalent mental illnesses that we struggle with today. So 1 in 10 U.S. adults is taking antidepressants. This is from the CDC National Health and Nutrition Survey. I'm not here to demonize antidepressants. They are very useful for certain portions of the population, and I think that they should have access to them. But there are some issues with these drugs that I think we should consider. The first is that they are really only used primarily for chronic depression. They aren't as useful for moderate to mild depression, which is what most people suffer from. Another issue is that they take about 6 to 9 months of daily usage to provide relief from symptoms of the disease. And this can be a problem because long-term antidepressant use can have some very unpleasant side effects. According to Wang et al., they can lead to sexual dysfunction, liver damage, gastrointestinal issues, and cardiovascular issues. And this explains the finding by Bakhting et al. That sometimes as little as 30% of individuals actually take their antidepressant medications for the full term that they've been prescribed for. And this is more than likely because of these side effects, and because they're not able to handle these side effects. So the treatment exists, but it isn't as useful as it could be, nor is it useful for a lot of people who need help but can't use these specific class of drugs. And depressive disorders are not the only disorder that has issues like this with the drugs used to treat them. Anxiety disorders according to the Anxiety, Depression, and Depression Association of America, are typically treated via drugs through a class of drugs known as benzodiazepines, which includes such drugs as Xanax, Valium, alprazolam, and Klonopin, just to name a few. Now again, I'm not here to demonize benzos. They are extremely useful for a certain portion of the population. The problem is they were designed for short-term use, short-term as needed use. So individuals who need something that they can use for a long period of time, or that to relieve symptoms that are chronic and last for an extended period of time, aren't typically able to use benzodiazepines because long-term benzodiazepine use can have some fairly unpleasant side effects. According to the American Family Physician, these can include having difficulty remembering events, balance and motor control issues, and actual brain cell damage. And according to the American Addiction Centers, another large issue with benzos is that they're extremely addictive, especially in the long term. So a lot of people who come in for treatment for their anxiety actually end up coming back because they require treatment for their benzodiazepine addiction. So we have these tools. They're not as useful as they could be for treating the scope and scale of this mental health crisis that we're facing right now. And while they're useful for some people, clearly because of their side effects and relatively unsafe efficacy, are not useful for the vast majority of people. So what are we to do about this, as the number of individuals with mental health illnesses has steadily risen since the introduction of these drugs? They clearly aren't treating the root of the problem, or they aren't effective enough at treating symptoms to be able to curb this crisis. Well, we actually have done studies on a class of compounds in the 1950s that potentially would be much more useful and safe than these drugs. They're known as psychedelics. Some of you may have heard of psychedelics in the recreational sense because that is what they have garnered a reputation for due to the counterculture and hippie movement in the 60s and 70s that abused this class of substances for recreational purposes. What many people aren't aware of, however, is that they were initially brought here in the 1950s as strictly psychological and psychiatric research subjects. So they were looked at in clinics to treat anxiety and depression and substance abuse disorders, which you might notice are the treatment-resistant pathologies that we're currently facing today. So if they showed promise, what happened? Why are we not still researching them? Well, we are, but I'll get to that. First, a little bit more history. They were released by some undisciplined researchers into the general public, which is what led to them garnering this recreational reputation and led to them being scheduled as Schedule 1 by the Drug Enforcement Administration. What you might not know is if you don't know about what scheduling means, it's how the DEA determines what controlled substances are able to be used for. So Schedule 1 means that they have no medical properties and that they have a high propensity for abuse. Now, based on the studies that we had in the 1950s, this wasn't necessarily true, but it didn't stop them from getting scheduled. And it wasn't up until the 1990s when slow, deliberate research was allowed onto these substances. So for the past 20 or 30 years, there has been a progressive increase in the amount of studies being done on these chemicals because of the fairly impressive results that have come from these trials. I want to talk about one in particular because it is the one that is the compound that has been studied the most out of any of these chemicals, and it is the one that has shown the most promise of any of them for treating the issues that we're facing. This chemical is known as psilocybin. Psilocybin is found in hundreds of species of mushrooms. It is produced naturally, and in laboratory conditions, it has been shown to have some extremely impressive effects on people struggling with these mental health issues. It is being studied right now by some of the most impressive organizations in the world, such as the Imperial College of London and Johns Hopkins University. I want to talk a little bit about specifically what the results of some of these studies have been so you can get an idea for just how impressive these results are. So Johns Hopkins did a study on 51 terminal cancer patients. They were given a single dose of psilocybin, a single high dose of psilocybin. And what this led to was 60% of these patients were no longer clinically depressed or anxious after 6 months. And this is an extremely depressed and anxious population as they are terminal illness patients. So the fact that a single dose session of this compound could provide such long-lasting relief is something that should be noted. Another study done at the Imperial College of London compared the efficacy of antidepressants and anxiolytics, or the benzodiazepines, with psilocybin. They were also given a single high dose of psilocybin. And what they found was that they experienced remission in their chronic depression symptoms for over a year, which you might notice if you remember us talking about antidepressants, which took 6 to 9 months to even hope for remission, and that many could not even complete because of the side effects, as compared to a single dose of psilocybin that provides remission for a year, is a stark contrast. And another important fact that we should note. One more study that is not necessarily related to anxiety or depression, but still related to our topic, was done by Johns Hopkins. 15 treatment-resistant tobacco smokers were given a single high-dose session of psilocybin. This led to 80% of these patients confirming that they were abstinent from smoking after 6 months, and 60% of these patients were still abstinent from smoking after 2.5 years. This is important because many times addiction and substance abuse is a result of untreated pathologies such as anxiety or depression. And so to be able to treat the addiction in addition to the underlying anxiety and depression would be extremely impressive for a single session of any drug, especially one that has been shown through a meta-analysis done by Elsie in 2017 to be extremely safe and to have no reports of any major long-term clinical effects from any trial done on this compound. So you might be asking yourself, what am I supposed to do about this? This is interesting, and I never thought about this potentially, but I'm not a clinical researcher and I'm not a drug lobbyist, and so I don't know where I fit into this equation. Well, I really am hoping, in addition to arguing that they should be rescheduled for serious, disciplined, scientific research based on the results that we have, that you as a listener will have at least a new perspective that you might not have considered before. And that you might look into one of these organizations that has been doing work on these substances for decades. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and the Beckley Foundation are two of the most prominent nonprofit organizations that have been funding research into these substances for years. MAPS is especially focused on making sure that all of the lines are crossed and the I's are dotted because they know how important it is, based on what happened in the 1960s, to be disciplined and serious about this research. Because they believe, in addition to I believe, and that I hope that I have at least imparted on you, that the reputation that these substances have is not necessarily the only reputation they should have. I believe that they should be seen as potential, powerful medicines that, if more research is done, and they are shown to truly be as effective and safe as the research we have now has shown them to be, we should consider them as a powerful tool in our tool belt for handling a crisis that we currently are not equipped to fight and that is only getting worse by the day. And I hope that you, the listener, will hear this and potentially think about volunteering with one of these organizations, or in the future, if they are found to be effective and they are introduced into the psychiatric treatment paradigm, that you might remember this if someone you care about or someone that you love is struggling with something and they can't find relief and they can't find treatment, that you might remember this speech, or that you might remember the research you did into these substances, and that you might have a recommendation that could truly change someone's lives that really needs it. Thank you.